Chapter 8. Judas Maccabees. Judas Maccabees and his companions entered the villages secretly, summoned their kinsmen, and, by also enlisting others who remained faithful to Judaism, assembled about 6,000 men. They implored the Lord to look kindly upon his people, who were being oppressed on all sides, to have pity on the temple, which was profaned by godless men, to have mercy on the city, which was being destroyed and about to be leveled to the ground, to hearken to the blood that cried out to him, to remember the criminal slaughter of innocent children and the blasphemies uttered against his name, and to manifest his hatred of evil. Once Maccabees got his men organized, the Gentiles could not withstand him, for the Lord's wrath had now changed to mercy. Coming unexpectedly upon towns and villages, he would set them on fire. He captured strategic positions and put to flight a large number of the enemy. He preferred the knights as being especially helpful for such attacks. Soon the fame of his valor spread everywhere. First victory over Nicanor. When Philip saw that Judas was gaining ground little by little, and that his successful advances were becoming more frequent, he wrote to Ptolemy, governor of Cilicia and Phoenicia, to come to the aid of the king's government. Ptolemy promptly selected Nicanor, son of Patroclus, one of the chief friends, and sent him at the head of at least 20,000 armed men of various nations to wipe out the entire Jewish race. With him he associated Gorgias, a professional military commander, well versed in the art of war. Nicanor planned to raise the 2,000 talents of tribute owed by the king to the Romans by selling captured Jews into slavery. So he immediately sent word to the coastal cities, inviting them to buy Jewish slaves and promising to deliver 90 slaves for a talent. Little did he dream of the punishment that was to fall upon him from the Almighty. When Judas learned of Nicanor's advance and informed his companions about the approach of the army, the cowardly and those who lacked faith in God's justice deserted and got away. But the others sold everything they had left, and at the same time besought the Lord to deliver those whom the ungodly Nicanor had sold before even meeting them. They begged the Lord to do this, if not for their sake, at least for the sake of the covenants made with their forefathers, and because they themselves bore his holy, glorious name. Maccabees assembled his men, 6,000 strong, and exhorted them not to be panic-stricken before the enemy, nor to fear the large number of the Gentiles attacking them unjustly, but to fight courageously, keeping before their eyes the lawless outrage perpetrated by the Gentiles against the holy place and the affliction of the humiliated city, as well as the subversion of their ancestral way of life. They trust in weapons and acts of daring, he said, but we trust in Almighty God, who can by a mere nod destroy not only those who attack us, but the whole world. He went on to tell them of the times when help had been given their ancestors, both the time of Sennacherib, when 185,000 of his men were destroyed, and the time of the battle in Babylonia against the Galatians, when only 8,000 Jews fought along with 4,000 Macedonians. Yet, when the Macedonians were hard-pressed, the 8,000 routed 120,000, and took a great quantity of booty because of the help they received from heaven. With such words he encouraged them, and made them ready to die for their laws and their country. Then Judas divided his army into 4, placing his brothers Simon, Joseph, and Jonathan, each over a division, assigning to each 1,500 men. There was also Eleazar. After reading to them from the Holy Book, and giving them the watchword, the help of God, he himself took charge of the 1st division, and joined in battle with Nicanor. With the Almighty as their ally, they killed more than 9,000 of the enemy, wounded and disabled the greater part of Nicanor's army, and put all of them to flight. They also seized the money of those who had come to buy them as slaves. When they had pursued the enemy for some time, they were obliged to return by reason of the late hour. It was the day before the Sabbath, and for that reason they could not continue the pursuit. They collected the enemy's arms and stripped them of their spoils, and then observed the Sabbath with fervent praise and thanks to the Lord, who kept them safe for that day on which he let descend on them the first dew of his mercy. After the Sabbath they gave a share of the booty to the persecuted and to widows and orphans. The rest they divided among themselves and their children. When this was, they also challenged the forces of Timothy and Bacchides, killed more than 20,000 of them, and captured some very high fortresses. They divided the enormous plunder, allotting half to themselves, and the rest to the persecuted, to orphans, widows, and the aged. They collected the enemy's weapons and carefully stored them in suitable places. The rest of the spoils they carried to Jerusalem. They also killed the commander of Timothy's forces, a most wicked man who had done great harm to the Jews. While celebrating the victory in their ancestral city, they burned both those who had set fire to the sacred gates and Callisthenes, who had taken refuge in a little house. So he received the reward his wicked deeds deserved. Humiliation of Nicanor. The accursed Nicanor, who had brought the 1,000 slave dealers to buy the Jews, after being humbled through the Lord's help by those whom he had thought of no account, laid aside his fine clothes and fled alone across country like a runaway slave until he reached Antioch. He was eminently successful in destroying his own army. So he, who had promised to provide tribute for the Romans by the capture of the people of Jerusalem, testified that the Jews had a champion, and that they were invulnerable for the very reason that they followed the laws laid down by him. Chapter 9. Punishment and Death of Antiochus. About that time, Antiochus retreated in disgrace from the region of Persia. He had entered the city called Persepolis, and attempted to rob the temple and gain control of the city. Thereupon, the people had swift recourse to arms, and Antiochus's men were routed, so that in the end Antiochus was put to flight by the natives and forced to beat a shameful retreat. On his arrival in Ecbatana, he learned what had happened to Nicanor and to Timothy's forces. Overcome with anger, he planned to make the Jews suffer for the injury done by those who had put him to flight. Therefore, he ordered his charioteer to drive without stopping until he finished the journey. Yet the condemnation of heaven rode with him, since he said in his arrogance, "I will make Jerusalem the common graveyard of the Jews as soon as I arrive there." So the all-seeing Lord, the God of Israel, struck him down with an unseen but incurable blow. For scarcely had he uttered those words, when he was seized with excruciating pains in his bowels and sharp internal torment, a fit punishment for him who had tortured the bowels of others with many barbarous torments. Far from giving up his insolence, he was all the more filled with arrogance. Breathing fire in his rage against the Jews, he gave orders to drive even faster. As a result, he hurtled from the dashing chariot, and every part of his body was racked by the violent fall. Thus he who previously, in his superhuman presumption, thought he could command the waves of the sea, and imagined he could weigh the mountain-tops in his scales, was now thrown to the ground, and had to be carried on a litter, clearly manifesting to all the power of God. The body of this impious man swarmed with worms, and while he was still alive in hideous torments, his flesh rotted off, so that the entire army was sickened by the stench of his corruption. Shortly before, he had thought that he could reach the stars of heaven, and now no one could endure to transport the man because of this intolerable stench. At last, broken in spirit, he began to give up his excessive arrogance, and to gain some understanding under the scourge of God, for he was racked with pain unceasingly. When he could no longer bear his own stench, he said, "It is right to be subject to God, and not to think one's mortal self divine." Then this vile man vowed to the Lord, who would no longer have mercy on him, that he would set free the holy city, toward which he had been hurrying with the intention of leveling it to the ground and making it a common graveyard. He would put on perfect equality with the Athenians all the Jews whom he had judged not even worthy of burial, but fit only to be thrown out with their children, to be eaten by vultures and wild animals. He would adorn with the finest offerings the holy temple, which he had previously despoiled. He would restore all the sacred vessels many times over, and would provide from his own revenues the expenses required for the sacrifices. Besides all this, he would become a Jew himself, and visit every inhabited place to proclaim there the power of God. But since God's punishment had justly come upon him, his sufferings were not lessened. So he lost hope for himself, and wrote the following letter to the Jews in the form of a supplication. It read thus: "To my esteemed Jewish citizens, Antiochus, their king and general, sends hearty greetings and best wishes for their health and happiness. If you and your children are well, and your affairs are going as you wish, I thank God very much, for my hopes are in heaven. Now that I am ill, I recall with affection the esteem and goodwill you bear me. On returning from the regions of Persia, I fell victim to a troublesome illness, so I thought it necessary to form plans for the general welfare of all. Actually, I do not despair about my health, since I have great hopes of recovering from my illness. Nevertheless, I know that my father, whenever he went on campaigns in the hinterland, would name his successor, so that if anything unexpected happened, or any unwelcome news came, the people throughout the realm would know to whom the government had been entrusted, and so not be disturbed. I am also bearing in mind that the neighboring rulers, especially those on the borders of our kingdom, are on the watch for opportunities and waiting to see what will happen. I have therefore appointed as king my son Antiochus, whom I have often before entrusted and commended to most of you, when I made hurried visits to the outlying provinces. I have written to him the letter copied below. Therefore, I beg and entreat each of you to remember the general and individual benefits you have received, and to continue to show goodwill toward me and my son. I am confident that following my policy, he will treat you with mildness and kindness in his relations with you. So this murderer and blasphemer, after extreme sufferings such as he had inflicted on others, died a miserable death in the mountains of a foreign land. His foster brother Philip brought the body home, but fearing Antiochus' son, he later withdrew into Egypt to Ptolemy Philometor. Chapter 10. Purification of Temple and City. When Maccabees and his companions, under the Lord's leadership, had recovered the temple and the city, they destroyed the altars erected by the Gentiles in the marketplace and the sacred enclosures. After purifying the temple, they made a new altar. Then, with fire struck from flint, they offered sacrifice for the first time in 2 years, burned incense and lighted lamps. They also set out the showbread. When they had done this, they prostrated themselves and begged the Lord that they might never again fall into such misfortunes, and that, if they should sin at any time, he might chastise them with moderation and not hand them over to blasphemous and barbarous Gentiles. On the anniversary of the day on which the temple had been profaned by the Gentiles, that is, the 25th of the same month, Tlev, the purification of the temple took place. The Jews celebrated joyfully for 8 days, as on the Feast of Booths, remembering how, a little while before, they had spent the Feast of Booths living like wild animals in caves on the mountains. Carrying rods entwined with leaves, green branches, and palms, they sang hymns of grateful praise to him who had brought about the purification of his own place. By public edict and decree, they prescribed that the whole Jewish nation should celebrate these days every year. Renewed persecution. Death of Ptolemy. Such was the end of Antiochus, surnamed Epiphanes. Now we shall relate what happened under Antiochus Eupator, the son of that godless man, and shall give a summary of the chief evils caused by the wars. When Eupator succeeded to the kingdom, he put a certain Lysaeus in charge of the government as commander-in-chief of Coele-Syria and Phoenicia. Ptolemy, surnamed Macron, had taken the lead in treating the Jews fairly because of the previous injustice that had been done them, and he endeavored to have peaceful relations with them. As a result, he was accused before Eupator by the king's friends. In fact, on all sides, he heard himself called a traitor for having abandoned Cyprus, which Philometor had entrusted to him, and for having gone over to Antiochus Epiphanes. Since he could not command the respect due to his high office, he ended his life by taking poison. Victory over the Idumeans. When Georgius became governor of the region, he employed foreign troops and used every opportunity to attack the Jews. At the same time, the Idumeans, who held some important strongholds, were harassing the Jews. They welcomed fugitives from Jerusalem and endeavored to continue the war. Maccabees and his companions, after public prayers, asking God to be their ally, moved quickly against the strongholds of the Idumeans. Attacking vigorously, they gained control of the places, drove back all who manned the walls, and cut down those who opposed them, killing as many as 20,000 men. When at least 9,000 took refuge in 2 very strong towers, containing everything necessary to sustain a siege, Maccabees left Simon and Joseph, along with Zacchaeus and his men, in sufficient numbers to besiege them, while he himself went off to places where he was more urgently needed. But some of the men in Simon's force, who were money lovers, let themselves be bribed by some of the men in the towers. On receiving 70,000 drachmas, they allowed a number of them to escape. When Maccabees was told what had happened, he assembled the rulers of the people and accused those men of having sold their kinsmen for money by setting their enemies free to fight against them. So he put them to death as traitors, and, without delay, captured the 2 towers. As he was successful at arms in all his undertakings, he destroyed more than 20,000 men in the 2 strongholds. Victory over Timothy. Timothy, who had previously been defeated by the Jews, gathered a tremendous force of foreign troops and collected a large number of cavalry from Asia. Then he appeared in Judea, ready to conquer it by force. At his approach, Maccabees and his men made supplication to God, sprinkling earth upon their heads and girding their loins in sackcloth. Lying prostrate at the foot of the altar, they begged him to be gracious to them, and to be an enemy to their enemies, and a foe to their foes, as the Lord declares. After the prayer, they took up their arms and advanced a considerable distance from the city, halting when they were close to the enemy. As soon as dawn broke, the armies joined battle, the one having as pledge of success and victory not only their valor, but also their reliance on the Lord, and the other taking fury as their leader in the fight. In the midst of the fierce battle, there appeared to the enemy from the heavens 5 majestic men riding on golden bridled horses, who led the Jews on. They surrounded Maccabees, and shielding him with their own armor, kept him from being wounded. They shot arrows and hurled thunderbolts at the enemy, who were bewildered and blinded, thrown into confusion and routed. 2,500 of their foot soldiers and 600 of their horsemen were slain. Timothy, however, fled to a well-fortified stronghold called Gazara, where Chaereas was in command. For 4 days, Maccabees and his men eagerly besieged the fortress. Those inside, relying on the strength of the place, kept repeating outrageous blasphemies and uttering abominable words. When the 5th day dawned, 20 young men in the army of Maccabees, angered over such blasphemies, bravely stormed the wall and with savage fury cut down everyone they encountered. Others who climbed up the same way swung around on the defenders, taking the besieged in the rear. They put the towers to the torch, spread the fire, and burned the blasphemers alive. Still others broke down the gates and let in the rest of the troops, who took possession of the city. Timothy had hidden in a cistern, but they killed him along with his brother Chaereas and Apollophanes. On completing these exploits, they blessed with hymns of grateful praise the Lord who shows great kindness to Israel and grants them victory. Chapter 11. Defeat of Lysias. Very soon afterward, Lysias, guardian and kinsman of the king, and head of the government, being greatly displeased at what had happened, mustered about 80,000 infantry and all his cavalry and marched against the Jews. His plan was to make Jerusalem a Greek settlement, to levy tribute on the temple as he did on the sanctuaries of the other nations, and to put the high priesthood up for sale every year. He did not take God's power into account at all, but felt exultant confidence in his myriads of foot soldiers, his thousands of horsemen, and his 80 elephants. So he invaded Judea, and when he reached Beth-zur, a fortified place about 20 miles from Jerusalem, launched a strong attack against it. When Maccabees and his men learned that Lysias was besieging the strongholds, they and all the people begged the Lord with lamentations and tears to send a good angel to save Israel. Maccabees himself was the first to take up arms, and he exhorted the others to join him in risking their lives to help their kinsmen. Then they resolutely set out together. Suddenly, while they were still near Jerusalem, a horseman appeared at their head, clothed in white garments and brandishing gold weapons. Then all of them together thanked God for his mercy, and their hearts were filled with such courage that they were ready to assault not only men, but the most savage beasts, yes, even walls of iron. Now that the Lord had shown his mercy toward them, they advanced in battle order with the aid of their heavenly ally. Hurling themselves upon the enemy like lions, they laid low 11,000 foot soldiers and 1,600 horsemen, and put all the rest to flight. Most of those who got away were wounded and stripped of their arms, while Lysias himself escaped only by shameful flight. Peace with the Syrians. But Lysias was not a stupid man. He reflected on the defeat he had suffered, and came to realize that the Hebrews were invincible because the mighty God was their ally. He therefore sent a message persuading them to settle everything on just terms, and promising to persuade the king also, and to induce him to become their friend. Maccabees, solicitous for the common good, agreed to all that Lysias proposed, and the king on his part granted in behalf of the Jews all the written requests of Maccabees to Lysias. Official letters. These are the terms of the letter which Lysias wrote to the Jews. Lysias sends greetings to the Jewish people. John and Absalom, your envoys, have presented your signed communication and asked about the matters contained in it. Whatever had to be referred to the king, I called to his attention, and the things that were acceptable he has granted. If you maintain your loyalty to the government, I will endeavor to further your interests in the future. On the details of these matters, I have authorized my representatives, as well as your envoys, to confer with you. Farewell. The year 148, the 24th of Dioscorinthius. The king's letter read thus. King Antiochus sends greetings to his brother Lysias. Now that our father has taken his place among the gods, we wish the subjects of our kingdom to be undisturbed in conducting their own affairs. We understand that the Jews do not agree with our father's policy concerning Greek customs, but prefer their own way of life. They are petitioning us to let them retain their own customs. Since we desire that this people too should be undisturbed, our decision is that their temple be restored to them, and that they live in keeping with the customs of their ancestors. Accordingly, please send them messengers to give them our assurances of friendship, so that when they learn of our decision, they may have nothing to worry about, but may contentedly go about their own business. The king's letter to the people was as follows. King Antiochus sends greetings to the Jewish Senate and to the rest of the Jews. If you are well, it is what we desire. We too are in good health. Menelaus has told us of your wish to return home and attend to your own affairs. Therefore, those who return by the 30th of Xanthicus will have our assurance of full permission to observe their dietary laws and other laws, just as before, and none of the Jews shall be molested in any way for faults committed through ignorance. I have also sent Menelaus to reassure you. Farewell. In the year 148, the 15th of Xanthicus. The Romans also sent them a letter as follows. Quintus Memmius and Titus Manius, legates of the Romans, send greetings to the Jewish people. Whatever Lysias, kinsman of the king, has granted you, we also approve. But the matters on which he passed judgment should be submitted to the king. As soon as you have considered them, send someone to us with your decisions, so that we may present them to your advantage, for we are on our way to Antioch. Make haste, then, to send us those who can inform us of your intentions. Farewell. In the year 148, the 15th of Xanthicus. Chapter 12. Persecution renewed. After these agreements were made, Lysias returned to the king, and the Jews went about their farming. But some of the local governors, Timothy and Apollonius, son of Genaus, as also Hieronymus and Demophon, to say nothing of Nicanor, the commander of the Cyprians, would not allow them to live in peace. Some people of Joppa also committed this outrage. They invited the Jews who lived among them, together with their wives and children, to embark on boats which they had provided. There was no hint of enmity toward them. This was done by public vote of the city. When the Jews, not suspecting treachery, and wishing to live on friendly terms, accepted the invitation, the people of Joppa took them out to sea, and drowned at least 200 of them. Activity of Judas. As soon as Judas heard of the barbarous deed perpetrated against his countrymen, he summoned his men, and after calling upon God, the just judge, he marched against the murderers of his kinsmen. In a night attack, he set the harbor on fire, burnt the boats, and put to the sword those who had taken refuge there. When the gates of the town were shut, he withdrew, intending to come back later and wipe out the entire population of Joppa. On hearing that the men of Jamnia planned to give like treatment to the Jews who lived among them, he attacked the Jamnian populace by night setting fire to the harbor and the fleet, so that the glow of the flames was visible as far as Jerusalem, 30 miles away. When the Jews had gone about a mile from there in the campaign against Timothy, they were attacked by Arabs, numbering at least 5,000 foot soldiers and 500 horsemen. After a hard fight, Judas and his companions, with God's help, were victorious. The defeated nomads begged Judas to make friends with them and promised to supply the Jews with cattle and to help them in every other way. Realizing that they could indeed be useful in many respects, Judas agreed to make peace with them. After the pledge of friendship had been exchanged, the Arabs withdrew to their tents. He also attacked a certain city called Caspin, fortified with earthworks and ramparts, and inhabited by a mixed population of Gentiles. Relying on the strength of their walls and their supply of provisions, the besieged treated Judas and his men with contempt, insulting them and even uttering blasphemies and profanity. But Judas and his men invoked the aid of the great sovereign of the world, who in the day of Joshua overthrew Jericho without battering ram or siege machine. Then they furiously stormed the ramparts. Capturing the city by the will of God, they inflicted such indescribable slaughter on it that the adjacent pool, which was about a quarter of a mile wide, seemed to be filled with the blood that flowed into it. When they had gone on some 90 miles, they reached Sharax, where there were certain Jews known as Tubiani. But they did not find Timothy in that region, for he had already departed from there without having done anything except to leave behind in one place a very strong garrison. But Dositheus and Sosipater, two of Maccabees' captains, marched out and destroyed the force of more than 10,000 men that Timothy had left in the stronghold. Meanwhile, Maccabees divided his army into cohorts, with a commander over each cohort, and went in pursuit of Timothy, who had a force of 120,000 foot soldiers and 2,500 horsemen. When Timothy learned of the approach of Judas, he sent on ahead of him the women and children, as well as the baggage, to a place called Carnion, which was hard to besiege and even hard to reach because of the difficult terrain of that region. But when Judas's first cohort appeared, the enemy was overwhelmed with fear and terror at the manifestation of the all-seeing. Scattering in every direction, they rushed away in such headlong flight that in many cases they wounded one another, pierced by the swords of their own men. Judas pressed the pursuit vigorously, putting the sinners to the sword and destroying as many as 30,000 men. Timothy himself fell into the hands of the men under Dositheus and Sosipater, but with great cunning he asked them to spare his life and let him go, because he had in his power the parents and relatives of many of them, and could make these suffer. When he had fully confirmed his solemn pledge to restore them unharmed, they let him go for the sake of saving their brethren. Further successes. Judas then marched to Carnion and the shrine of Artagatis, where he killed 25,000 people. After the defeat and destruction of these, he moved his army to Ephron, a fortified city inhabited by people of many nationalities. Robust young men took up their posts in defense of the walls, from which they fought valiantly. Inside were large supplies of machines and missiles. But the Jews, invoking the sovereign who forcibly shatters the might of his enemies, got possession of the city and slaughtered 25,000 of the people in it. Then they set out from there and hastened on to Scythopolis, 75 miles from Jerusalem. But when the Jews who lived there testified to the goodwill shown by the Scythopolitans, and to their kind treatment even in times of adversity, Judas and his men thanked them and exhorted them to be well disposed to their race in the future also. Finally, they arrived in Jerusalem shortly before the Feast of Weeks. After this feast, called Pentecost, they lost no time in marching against Gorgias, governor of Idumea, who opposed them with 3,000 foot soldiers and 400 horsemen. In the ensuing battle, a few of the Jews were slain. A man called Dositheus, a powerful horseman, and one of Bacanor's men, caught hold of Gorgias, grasped his military cloak, and dragged him along by main strength, intending to capture the vile wretch alive, when a Thracian horseman attacked Dositheus and cut off his arm at the shoulder. Then Gorgias fled to Marissa. After Esdras and his men had been fighting for a long time and were weary, Judas called upon the Lord to show himself their ally and leader in the battle. Then, raising a battle cry in his ancestral language, and with songs, he charged Gorgias's men when they were not expecting it and put them to flight. Expiation for the dead. Judas rallied his army and went to the city of Adullam. As the week was ending, they purified themselves according to custom and kept the Sabbath there. On the following day, since the task had now become urgent, Judas and his men went to gather up the bodies of the slain and bury them with their kinsmen in their ancestral tombs. But under the tunic of each of the dead, they found amulets sacred to the idols of Gemnia, which the law forbids the Jews to wear. So it was clear to all that this was why these men had been slain. They all therefore praised the ways of the Lord, the just judge, who brings to light the things that are hidden. Turning to supplication, they prayed that the sinful deed might be fully blotted out. The noble Judas warned the soldiers to keep themselves free from sin, for they had seen with their own eyes what had happened because of the sin of those who had fallen. He then took up a collection among all his soldiers, amounting to 2,000 silver drachmas, which he sent to Jerusalem to provide for an expiatory sacrifice. In doing this, he acted in a very excellent and noble way, inasmuch as he had the resurrection of the dead in view. For if he were not expecting the fallen to rise again, it would have been useless and foolish to pray for them in death. But if he did this with a view to the splendid reward that awaits those who had gone to rest in godliness, it was a holy and pious thought. Thus he made atonement for the dead, that they might be freed from this sin. Chapter 13. The Syrians invade Judea. In the year 149, Judas and his men learned that Antiochus Eupator was invading Judea with a large force, and that with him was Lysias, his guardian, who was in charge of the government. They led a Greek army of 110,000 foot soldiers, 5,300 horsemen, 22 elephants, and 300 chariots armed with scythes. Death of Menelaus. Menelaus also joined them, and, with great duplicity, kept urging Antiochus on, not for the welfare of his country, but in the hope of being established in office. But the King of Kings aroused the anger of Antiochus against the scoundrel. When the king was shown by Lysias that Menelaus was to blame for all the trouble, he ordered him to be taken to Beroea and executed there in the customary local method. There is at that place a tower 75 feet high, full of ashes, with a circular rim sloping down steeply on all sides toward the ashes. A man guilty of sacrilege or notorious for certain other crimes is brought up there, and then hurled down to destruction. In such a manner was Menelaus, the transgressor of the law, fated to die. He was deprived even of decent burial. It was altogether just that he who had committed so many sins against the altar with its pure fire and ashes should meet his death in ashes. Skirmish near Modin. The king was advancing, his mind full of savage plans for inflicting on the Jews worse things than those they suffered in his father's time. When Judas learned of this, he urged the people to call upon the Lord night and day, to help them now, if ever, when they were about to be deprived of their law, their country, and their holy temple, and not to allow this nation, which had just begun to revive, to be subjected again to blasphemous Gentiles. When they had all joined in doing this, and had implored the merciful Lord continuously with weeping and fasting and prostrations for 3 days, Judas encouraged them and told them to stand ready. After a private meeting with the elders, he decided that before the king's army could invade Judea and take possession of the city, the Jews should march out and settle the matter with God's help, leaving the outcome to the Creator of the world, and exhorting his followers to fight nobly to death for the laws, the temple, the city, the country, and the government. He pitched his camp near Modin. Giving his men the battle cry, "God's victory," he made a night attack on the king's pavilion with a picked force of the bravest young men, and killed about 2,000 in the camp. They also slew the lead elephant and its rider. Finally, they withdrew in triumph, having filled the camp with terror and confusion. Day was just breaking when this was accomplished, with the help and protection of the Lord. Treaty with Antiochus V. The king, having had a taste of the Jews' daring, tried to take their positions by a stratagem. So he marched against Beth-zur, a strong fortress of the Jews. But he was driven back, checked, and defeated. Judas then sent supplies to the men inside, but Rhodocus of the Jewish army betrayed military secrets to the enemy. he was found out, arrested, and imprisoned. The king made a second attempt by negotiating with the men of Bethzul. After giving them his pledge and receiving theirs, he withdrew and attacked Judas and his men. But he was defeated. Next, he heard that Philip, who was left in charge of the government in Antioch, had rebelled. Dismayed, he parleyed with the Jews, submitted to their terms, and swore to observe their rites. Having come to this agreement, he offered a sacrifice and honored the temple with a generous donation. He approved of Maccabees, and left him as military and civil governor of the territory, from Ptolemais to the region of the Gadarenes. When he came to Ptolemais, the people of that city were angered by the peace treaty. In fact, they were so indignant that they wanted to annul its provisions. But Lysias took the platform, defended the treaty as well as he could, and won them over by persuasion. After calming them and gaining their goodwill, he returned to Antioch. That is how the king's attack and withdrawal went. Chapter 14. Antagonism of Alcimus. 3 years later, Judas and his men learned that Demetrius, son of Seleucus, had sailed into the port of Tripolis with a powerful army and a fleet, and that he had occupied the country after doing away with Antiochus and his guardian Lysias. A certain Alcimus, a former high priest, who had willfully incurred defilement at the time of the revolt, realized that there was no way for him to salvage his position and regain access to the holy altar. So he went to King Demetrius in the year 151, and presented him with a gold crown and a palm branch, as well as some of the customary olive branches from the temple. On that occasion he kept quiet. But he found an opportunity to further his mad scheme when he was invited to the council by Demetrius and questioned about the dispositions and intentions of the Jews. He replied, "Those Jews called Hasideans, led by Judas Maccabeus, are warmongers, who stir up sedition and keep the kingdom from enjoying peace and quiet. For this reason, now that I am deprived of my ancestral dignity, that is to say, the high priesthood, I have come here, first, out of my genuine concern for the king's interests, and secondly, out of consideration for my own countrymen, since our entire nation is suffering great affliction from the unreasonable conduct of the people just mentioned. When you have informed yourself in detail on these matters, O king, act in the interest of our country and its hard-pressed people with the same gracious consideration that you show toward all. As long as Judas is around, it is impossible for the state to enjoy peace." When he had said this, the other friends who were hostile to Judas quickly added fuel to Demetrius's indignation. Dealings with Nicanor. The king immediately chose Nicanor, who had been in command of the elephants, and appointed him governor of Judea. He sent him off with orders to put Judas to death, to disperse his followers, and to set up Alcimus as high priest of the great temple. The Gentiles from Judea, who would have banished Judas, came flocking to Nicanor, thinking that the misfortunes and calamities of the Jews would mean prosperity for themselves. When the Jews heard of Nicanor's coming, and that the Gentiles were rallying to him, they sprinkled themselves with earth, and prayed to him who established his people forever, and who always comes to the aid of his heritage. At their leader's command, they set out at once, and came upon the enemy at the village of Adasa. Judas's brother Simon had engaged Nicanor, but because of the sudden appearance of the enemy, suffered a slight repulse. However, when Nicanor heard of the valor of Judas and his men, and the great courage with which they fought for their country, he shrank from deciding the issue by bloodshed. So he sent Posidonius Theodotus and Mattathias to arrange an agreement. After a long discussion of the terms, each leader communicated them to his troops, and when general agreement was expressed, they assented to the treaty. A day was set on which the leaders would meet by themselves. From each side a chariot came forward, and thrones were set in place. Judas had posted armed men in readiness at suitable points, for fear that the enemy might suddenly carry out some treacherous plan. But the conference was held in the proper way. Nicanor stayed on in Jerusalem, where he did nothing out of place. He got rid of the throngs of ordinary people who gathered around him, but he always kept Judas in his company, for he had a cordial affection for the man. He urged him to marry and have children, so Judas married, settled down, and shared the common life. Threats against Judas. When Alcimus saw their friendship for each other, he took the treaty that had been made, went to Demetrius, and said that Nicanor was plotting against the state, and that he had appointed Judas, the conspirator against the kingdom, to be his successor. Stirred up by the villain's calumnies, the king became enraged. He wrote to Nicanor, stating that he was displeased with the treaty, and ordering him to send Maccabees as a prisoner to Antioch without delay. When this message reached Nicanor, he was dismayed, for he hated to break his agreement with a man who had done no wrong. However, there was no way of opposing the king, so he watched for an opportunity to carry out this order by a stratagem. But Maccabees noticed that Nicanor was becoming cool in his dealings with him, and acting with unaccustomed rudeness when they met. He concluded that this coldness betokened no good. So he gathered together a large number of his men, and went into hiding from Nicanor. When Nicanor realized that he had been disgracefully outwitted by the man, he went to the great and holy temple at a time when the priests were offering the customary sacrifices, and ordered them to surrender Judas. As they declared under oath that they did not know where the wanted man was, he raised his right hand toward the temple and swore this oath: "If you do not hand Judas over to me as prisoner, I will level this shrine of God to the ground. I will tear down the altar and erect here a splendid temple to Dionysus." With these words he went away. The priests stretched out their hands toward heaven, calling upon the unfailing defender of our nation in these words: "Lord of all, though you are in need of nothing, you have approved of a temple for your dwelling place among us. Therefore, O Holy One, Lord of all holiness, preserve forever undefiled this house, which has been so recently purified." The story of Razis. A certain Razis, one of the elders of Jerusalem, was denounced to Nicanor as a patriot. A man highly regarded, he was called a father of the Jews because of his love for them. In the early days of the revolt, he had been convicted of Judaism and had risked body and life in his ardent zeal for it. Nicanor, to show his detestation of the Jews, sent more than 500 soldiers to arrest him. He thought that by arresting such a man, he would deal the Jews a hard blow. But when these troops, on the point of capturing the tower, were forcing the outer gate and calling for fire to set the door ablaze, Razis, now caught on all sides, turned his sword against himself, preferring to die nobly rather than fall into the hands of vile men and suffer outrages unworthy of his noble birth. In the excitement of the struggle, he failed to strike exactly. So while the troops rushed in through the doors, he gallantly ran up to the top of the wall and, with manly courage, threw himself down into the crowd. But as they quickly drew back and left an opening, he fell into the middle of the empty space. Still breathing and inflamed with anger, he got up and ran through the crowd, with blood gushing from his frightful wounds. Then, standing on a steep rock, as he lost the last of his blood, he tore out his entrails and flung them with both hands into the crowd, calling upon the Lord of life and of spirit to give these back to him again. Such was the manner of his death. Chapter 15. Nicanor's blasphemy. When Nicanor learned that Judas and his companions were in the territory of Samaria, he decided to attack them in all safety on the day of rest. The Jews who were forced to follow him pleaded, "Do not massacre them in that way, like a savage barbarian, but show respect for the day which the All-Seeing has exalted with holiness above all other days." At this, the thrice sinful wretch asked if there was a ruler in heaven who prescribed the keeping of the Sabbath day. When they replied that there was indeed such a ruler in heaven, the living Lord himself, who commanded the observance of the Sabbath day, he said, "I, on my part, am ruler on earth, and my orders are that you take up arms and carry out the king's business." Nevertheless, he did not succeed in carrying out his cruel plan. Fresh hope. In his utter boastfulness and arrogance, Nicanor had determined to erect a public monument of victory over Judas and his men. But Maccabees remained confident, fully convinced that he would receive help from the Lord. He urged his men not to fear the enemy, but, mindful of the help they had received from heaven in the past, to expect that now too victory would be given them by the Almighty. By encouraging them with words from the law and the prophets, and by reminding them of the battles they had already won, he filled them with fresh enthusiasm. Having stirred up their courage, he gave his orders and pointed out at the same time the perfidy of the Gentiles and their violation of oaths. When he had armed each of them, not so much with the safety of shield and spear, as with the encouragement of noble words, he cheered them all by relating a dream, a kind of vision worthy of belief. What he saw was this. Onias, the former high priest, a good and virtuous man, modest in appearance, gentle in manners, distinguished in speech, and trained from childhood in every virtuous practice, was praying with outstretched arms for the whole Jewish community. Then in the same way another man appeared, distinguished by his white hair and dignity, and with an air about him of extraordinary majestic authority. Onias then said of him, "This is God's prophet, Jeremiah, who loves his brethren, and fervently prays for his people and their holy city." Stretching out his right hand, Jeremiah presented a gold sword to Judas. As he gave it to him, he said, "Accept this holy sword as a gift from God. With it you shall crush your adversaries." Defeat and death of Nicanor. Encouraged by Judas's noble words, which had power to instill valor and stir young hearts to courage, the Jews determined not to delay, but to charge gallantly and decide the issue by hand-to-hand combat with the utmost courage, since their city and its temple with the sacred vessels were in danger. They were not so much concerned about their wives and children or their brothers and kinsmen. Their first and foremost fear was for the consecrated sanctuary. Those who remained in the city suffered a like agony, anxious as they were about the battle in the open country. Everyone now awaited the decisive moment. The enemy were already drawing near, with their troops drawn up in battle line, their elephants placed in strategic positions, and their cavalry stationed on the flanks. Maccabees, contemplating the hosts before him, their elaborate equipment, and the fierceness of their elephants, stretched out his hands toward heaven and called upon the Lord who works miracles. For he knew that it is not through arms, but through the Lord's decision that victory is won by those who deserve it. He prayed to him thus, "You, O Lord, sent your angel in the days of King Hezekiah of Judea, and he slew 185,000 men of Sennacherib's army. Sovereign of the heavens, send a good angel now to spread fear and dread before us. By the might of your arm, may those be struck down who have blasphemously come against your holy people." With this, he ended his prayer. Nicanor and his men advanced to the sound of trumpets and battle songs. But Judas and his men met the army with supplication and prayers. Fighting with their hands and praying to God with their hearts, they laid low at least 35,000, and rejoiced greatly over this manifestation of God's power. When the battle was over, and they were joyfully departing, they discovered Nicanor lying there in all his armor. So they raised tumultuous shouts in their native tongue in praise of the divine sovereign. Then Judas, who was ever in body and soul the chief defender of his fellow citizens, and had maintained from youth his affection for his countrymen, ordered Nicanor's head and whole right arm to be cut off and taken to Jerusalem. When he arrived there, he assembled his countrymen, stationed the priests before the altar, and sent for those in the citadel. He showed them the vile Nicanor's head and the wretched blasphemer's arm that had been boastfully stretched out against the holy dwelling of the Almighty. He cut out the tongue of the godless Nicanor, saying he would feed it piecemeal to the birds, and would hang up the other wages of his folly opposite the temple. At this, everyone looked toward heaven, and praised the Lord, who manifests his divine power, saying, "Blessed be he who has kept his own place undefiled." Judas hung up Nicanor's head on the wall of the citadel, a clear and evident proof to all of the Lord's help. By public vote, it was unanimously decreed never to let this day pass unobserved, but to celebrate it on the 13th day of the 12th month, called Adar in Aramaic, the eve of Mordecai's day. Epilogue. Author's apology. Since Nicanor's doings ended in this way, with the city remaining in possession of the Hebrews from that time on, I will bring my own story to an end here too. If it is well written and to the point,